All right, we are at the top of the hour. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our fifth annual Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Lecture. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. A couple of housekeeping announcements before I hand you over to my president and CEO, Benes Aldana. We are going to do a short Q&A at the end of this lecture session, so please send me all of your questions in the chat, and I will share them with the professor when we get to the Q&A session element of today's session. And without further delay, I would like to hand this over to President Aldana of the National Judicial College. President Aldana, I just sent you a video request. You have the floor.
Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the National Judicial College in Reno, Nevada. I'm Benes Aldana, President and CEO of the college, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special program, the fifth annual Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Lecture. As always, we gather near Justice Ginsburg's birthday, which was March 15. She would have turned 92 this year, so let us take a moment to say, Happy birthday, Justice Ginsburg. We all miss the strong and unwavering presence of the notorious RBG on the Supreme Court. Today, we are honored to hear from someone who knew Justice Ginsburg extremely well, Professor Arthur Miller, who has titled his talk, My Friend Ruth. I first met Professor Miller in 2019 when he moderated a panel I was on about educating the legal profession on artificial intelligence. Now, I'll admit, I was a little nervous. I had known of Professor Miller long before I ever met him. As a kid, I used to watch him on PBS, where he would moderate roundtable discussions with famous legal and policy experts. He had this signature way of posing hypothetical situations and then throwing out the big questions, making his panelists really think. So you can imagine my nerves going into that discussion. But all things with Professor Miller, it turned out to be an engaging and dynamic conversation, one I'll never forget. So it's really an honor to introduce him today. And let me tell you, it took some perseverance to get him here. From the very beginning of this lecture series, we have tried to secure Professor Miller as a speaker, but we never gave up. And finally, here we are. If that's not a lesson in perseverance, I don't know what is. And I would like to thank our communications director, Barbara Peck, for making it happen this year. Professor Miller first met the shy yet determined Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the 1950s when they were law students at Harvard, along with her husband, Marty. Now, that is a study group I would have loved to join. Their friendship spanned decades, beginning when they were young attorneys in New York. At one point, Professor Miller lobbied his law firm to hire the brilliant and energetic new graduate, only to be told the firm did not hire female attorneys. Undeterred, both he and Justice Ginsburg went on to build robust civil law practices, challenging the status quo and introducing new approaches to legal theories and rules. While Professor Miller forged a distinguished academic career writing numerous books in civil procedure and the federal courts, many of which are still studied today, he remained close to Ruth and Marty as she ascended to the Supreme Court. Beyond his scholarly contributions, Professor Miller has argued in cases in every U.S. Court of Appeals, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. He has worked as well as a Court of Appeals, his work extensively in public interest, focusing on private computer copyright in courts. He has also served appointment of 2 justices as member and reporter of the Advisory Committee on Civil Rules of the Judicial Conference of the United States, and has advised the American Law Institute and a special advisory group to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. A renowned commentator in law and society, Professor Miller won an Emmy for his work on PBS, The Constitution, That Delicate Balance, and served for 2 decades as the legal editor for ABC's Good Morning America. In the 1970s and 80s, he hosted the weekly show Miller's Court, where real lawyers and actors recreated court cases, followed by discussions with experts and the audience about the legal issues presented. His remarkable career has earned him numerous accolades, including 5 honorary degrees, 3 American Bar Association Gavel Awards, and a special recognition Gavel Award for promoting public understanding of the law. In 2011, he was honored by Queen Elizabeth II as the Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his contribution for charitable and media work. Today's event is made possible by a generous gift from a benefactor who wishes to remain anonymous. This support also funds scholarships for our Judicial Academy, a course designed for attorneys who aspire to become judges. If you know an attorney with that noble ambition, encourage them to apply by visiting judges.org. The next Judicial Academy session will be held in mid-October, and over the past 4 years, 36 alumni of this program have gone on to serve on the bench. Now, it is my great honor to introduce to you, also a big Yankees fan, Professor Arthur Miller. Professor?
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Seems odd to call you that, but it's a pleasure to be with you and the viewing audience. Let me tell you what today is not going to be. Today is not going to be a recitation of the purely legal achievements of Justice Ginsburg, either as a great advocate of women's rights for many years and then as a superb judge on the second highest court in the United States and then the highest court of the United States. This is going to be very personal. I'm going to tell you about my relationship with the justice and my impressions of her over the years. Because if you listen to the dates the president offered you carefully, you realize that I knew the justice for about 70 years. Please keep in mind that some of the things I may say about the justice reflect earlier ages and sensitivities or non-sensitivities that didn't exist back then. First, a touch of background. There's a certain parallelism to Ruth's, and from now on I will call her Ruth, to Ruth's life and my life. This is not to say that I have achieved the kind of glorious professional achievements that she did. It's just that in a strange way, our lives for a long time at least moved along almost in sync. For example, we were both born in Brooklyn. She was born in the same hospital I was born. She was born in the middle of 1933. I was born in the middle of 1934. There's barely a year, not even a year, that separates us. She grew up in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. I grew up in Brighton Beach. The distance between those two spots is less than 5 miles. She even had the nerve to go to Madison High School. Madison High School was the arch rival of my high school, which was Abraham Lincoln High School. We both grew up in Jewish families. Neither one of us became truly religious. Ruth found Orthodox Judaism oppressive, as did I, and she had an experience, which I did not have, of going to the services at the neighborhood synagogue and discovering that men and women were seated separately. That was a symbol of the age, the 1950s. That was a symbol of the Orthodox traditions of the Jewish faith. I think in a sense, we both were offended. And she did say, as life progressed, that one of the reasons that she did not become an observant Jew, as I am not, is the sense of inequality that she saw in the synagogue between men and women. And that is part of her life story. So much of her life is bound up with the inequality between the genders. So, how did we meet? I entered the Harvard Law School in 1955. It was the elitist institution of the day. I think it's a little less elitist today. And one of the people I got to know fairly early in the first year was Marty Ginsburg. We got to be friends. And as the fall of 55 progressed and the first year started to wear on us, because it was a very, very arduous program in those days, I was walking on campus with one of my other friends when there was Marty. And Marty was in the company of a woman. Marty was a handsome guy. I didn't know who the woman was. And all I knew was that she was a beautiful woman. I thought she was beautiful. I still think she was beautiful. Well, lo and behold, Marty introduced me to Ruth. And he clearly marked her out as his wife. And that was the first time I ever saw Ruth. Marty and Ruth had graduated from Cornell College, where they were both terrific students, and come to Cambridge, at least in Marty's case, to become a first-year student at the Harvard Law School. Ruth was not a member of the Harvard student body. She was, in a sense, between or in transition. The year ended. We went our separate ways. And when our second year began, it turned out that Marty and I were still classmates and friends, and Ruth had become a first-year student at the Harvard Law School. So there were times when we would get together socially, and my impression of Ruth was, yes, still beautiful, of course beautiful, but shy almost in the extreme. And that was a benchmark of Ruth at that time in her life. Marty and I went on to our third year, and we discovered that in a class of 9 women and over 500 men, Ruth had such tremendous grades in her first year that she was selected for the Harvard Law Review. That was the epitome of success at the Harvard Law School in those days. It was very elitist and, in a way, sort of discriminatory in separating out students based purely, I emphasize purely, on grades. Ruth had great grades, so she made the Harvard Law Review. The selection for the Harvard Law Review in those days was incredibly simple. If your grades carefully carried out to fractions of 100 and your rank in class which each student had from 1 to over 500, you were invited to join the Harvard Law Review. She did it without any attempt or instinct of bragging. I had made it the prior year. My grades had qualified me for the Harvard Law Review, and I was serving in her second year as an officer of the review. That brought me into virtually daily contact with Ruth and continuous contact with Ruth and Marty as the couple. In those days, if you were on the Harvard Law Review, which only the top 25 in the class of over 500 qualified for, that was your life. The Harvard Law Review was elitist in the extreme. It was professional in the extreme. It was incredibly attentive to accuracy. It was really your training ground. You learned as much from your activity on the Harvard Law Review as you did from your classes. You got to know the top 25 people in your class, and if you were in the third year, the top 25 people in the second year class. Now, at that point, Ruth had given birth to a daughter, Jane. The baby was somewhere between 14 and 19 months of age. Now, here's the rub from an operational point of view. There was no electronic research system in existence back then. There was no Lexis. There was no Westlaw. Guess what? The workload of the Harvard Law Review meant that you had to go to, heaven forfend, a library and pull down real books and read real cases in those books. And the culture of the Harvard Law Review said you had to do that somewhere between 8 and 12 hours a day, 6 days, actually 6.5 days a week. Problem. What was Ruth to do with baby Jane when she was in the library? The situation was complicated by the fact that Marty, her beloved husband, was really quite ill. And that Ruth had to do some of the prep work for Marty, who frequently could not attend class. Should she stay on the Harvard Law Review? She insisted that she could do it. She could go to class. She could put in her hours in the library and at the Harvard Law Review building, and she could take care of Marty. Not many human beings would undertake those responsibilities and those concerns, but it's Ruth we are talking about. Now, I was the articles editor for the Harvard Law Review, a position of officership in my third year, and I had an office. So Ruth made a deal with me. It's not much of a deal. It was a one-way deal. Arthur, she said, I have to go to the library for my 8 hours a day. Could you watch Baby Jane? And of course, I said yes. My knowledge of what that entailed was a vacuum. I knew nothing. I'm an only child. I don't have siblings. I don't really have many relatives. But for an entire academic year, every day, Ruth would come into my office at the Harvard Law Review building, wheeling a stroller or a baby carriage at times, and plunk Baby Jane down next to my desk and go off to the library. I had never experienced that kind of responsibility. Baby Jane could crawl quite a bit in those days, and there were staircases and other threatening circumstances in the Harvard Law Review building. So I had to do my work and watch out for Baby Jane and look out for the rearrival of Ruth for close to 9 months. And in that time, I got to know Ruth more than I got to know any of the second year editors. Now, Marty and I were in the graduating class. We knew we were leaving Cambridge. We know we were going into the real world. Both Marty and I had accepted positions at superb New York City big law firms, and we had to live in New York. So what was Ruth to do? She had achieved a wonderful academic achievement at the Harvard Law School. She had made the Harvard Law Review. She had built a beautiful reputation among the law review editors in my class, who eventually would choose the officers from her class. And for some of us, we thought not only would Ruth make a fine third-year officer, maybe law, she'd become the notes editor or the case editor, or like me, become the articles editor. Or radical thought for the 1950s. Maybe she'd be elected as the first woman president of the Harvard Law Review. Quite an achievement. In those days, unheard of. But many of us thought she was the cream of her class. Well, then unfortunate circumstances intervened. When she told the dean of the Harvard Law School, a great man, Erwin Griswold, a great dean, that she really could not stay in Cambridge for her third year because she felt, properly so, that she should go to New York with the child and with Marty. The dean said, the rules, now get this, the rules of the Harvard Law School since time immemorial said that if you did not complete 3 years of study at the Harvard Law School, you did not get a Harvard Law School degree. Now, that may seem crazy to you. It may sound mean to you. I can vouch for the fact that it was the rule, that there were cases before Ruth's in which someone did not complete 3 years at the Harvard Law School and had to be satisfied with a completion elsewhere. So, with a certain amount of resentment, I'll put it bluntly, Ruth left Cambridge and enrolled at Columbia Law School. That resentment, that feeling of having been cheated, that notion that perhaps there was a gender discrimination there, to my knowledge, there was no gender discrimination. The dean was applying the rule that had always existed. Scream at the rule, but it was the rule. But it never allowed Ruth to feel comfortable about the Harvard Law School. Ruth took her third year at Columbia, where she excelled, and she served on the Columbia Law Review in her third year there. I don't know of anyone else. I'm sure there must be other people who served on two distinguished law reviews while in law school. Ruth had spent year 2 as an editor of the Harvard Law Review, year 3 as an editor of the Columbia Law Review. So we were now at a law school, all of us, Marty, our mutual friends, Ruth, me. Before we left, we lived it up a little bit, socially speaking. I had 3 roommates in a nice apartment 1 block from the law school. 3 people who became lifelong friends, sadly, no longer with us. We built a tradition of having a cocktail party once a month. And we would invite classmates and mutual friends. We always invited Marty and Ruth. And in many months, Marty and Ruth would show up. And here, the contrast between those 2 people, lifelong husband and wife, was apparent. Marty was the proverbial life of the party. Marty would come in and start telling stories, and a crowd would gather around him because he was a great storyteller. Ruth would sort of move to a corner of the room, stand there, often by herself. The only time Ruth spoke during those events was when somebody went to Ruth, and there were a fair number of distinguished people would come as guests and talk to her. She was quite sociable, but quite exceedingly, in a way, shy. If you didn't talk to Ruth, Ruth didn't speak to you, not because she didn't like you, but because she was shy. And that became a benchmark of Ruth. More of that as we go along. So there we were in New York. Marty was at Weil, Gottschall, and Manges, a great firm. I was with Cleary, Gottlieb, Friendly, and Hamilton, then a powerhouse firm, The friendly became a great judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Ruth didn't have a job. Ruth didn't have a job, despite a brilliant academic record. The sad truth was that at the big firms like Marty's Weil and My Cleary, you wore a white shirt, you wore a hat, you were male. People lobbied to get her a job. People on the Columbia faculty in particular tried to get her a clerkship with a federal judge, something that students over the years have done cartwheels to achieve. Back in my day and Ruth's day, it wasn't the big deal that it became, but it was honorific. It introduced you to what courts do and how judges behave. It was thought by many to be a key to the academic world. It was a thing. One aspired to be a judge's clerk. No judge, no law firm would hire her. Very important judges turned her down, despite the fact that her qualifications were the equal or superior to people that they hired. Finally, pressure from a wonderful fellow on the Columbia faculty, actually a couple of fellows on the Columbia faculty, got her a clerkship with Judge Palmieri, a district judge in the Southern District of New York. And she clerked for a couple of years. Meantime, Marty and Ruth and I continued to associate. I went off to the Army for a bit. Marty had been a reservist in the Army. Indeed, the two of them had spent the period immediately following their graduation from Cornell in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. God knows why one would want to spend time there. Well, Marty had a military obligation. I had a military obligation. It was the era of the compulsory draft, and we each served. He at Fort Sill, me at Fort Dix in New Jersey. But we were in New York. We were on leave from our respective law firms. Ruth was clerking. Well, her 2-year clerkship more or less came to an end. And my military obligation was completed. I went back to Cleary Gottlieb. I've always loved that firm. 4 of my closest buddies from our Harvard Law School days were young associates at Cleary. And one day, probably the associate I was closest to, a great tax lawyer, and ironically, Marty was developing a reputation as being a genius tax lawyer and amassing incredibly important clients. My classmate at the firm and I said, by God, Ruth Ginsburg is better than most of the associates we see here. This is a terrific firm, but we know Ruth is more gifted. So we were young punks. our major achievement since law school was going in the Army. We had no record whatsoever, although they had hired us because they had faith in us. So the two of us decided to go see the managing partner. Firms were much more simple in those days. There was no firm in the city of New York that had 100 lawyers. That was thought to be inconceivable. One of the reasons the two of us had selected Cleary Gottlieb was that it had only 55, 60 lawyers, a medium-sized firm in those days. Ironically, Cleary Gottlieb now has over 1,200 lawyers and is still thought of as a medium-sized firm. But that's just a sociological aside. So the two of us went to the managing partner, a nice man, a talented lawyer. He held the keys to the appointment process. And we went in and we said we had a relationship with a very, very extraordinarily talented person on the Harvard Law Review a couple of years earlier. And we think she would be a great addition to the younger lawyers at Cleary Gottlieb. The managing partner looked at us and simply said, "Young man, you just don't seem to understand that this firm does not hire women." And that was big law in 1959, 1960. That was the reality. That was what somebody as talented as Ruth faced after her distinguished academic career. In about 1961, somewhere in there, I decided that maybe I wanted to be an academic. My mentor on the Harvard Law School faculty, a professor by the name of Benjamin Kaplan, who ironically was also Ruth's professor, had really impressed me with regard to the freedom of the academic life and the ability to do some good. So I was approached by Columbia to run a project. It was a project on international procedure. I love procedure. And they said, come, we've got projects that will put you back into contact with Professor Kaplan. We will even let you try your hand at teaching, because they had done a surveillance study of me and they knew I was toying with academia. So I went up to Columbia. I did my baptism on teaching, fell in love with it, worked on the federal rules of civil procedure, worked with my precious mentor, Benjamin Kaplan, and decided I would go into the academic market. And that would have left a gap at the project, which was doing important work in terms of international cases in the federal courts. I accepted an opportunity to teach at Minnesota. That may sound strange to some of you, but in those days, Minnesota was a breeding ground for young academics. And The politics at Columbia Law School trapped me. That's a long, funny story, which I won't go into. So guess who they got to replace me? Yep. Ruth Ginsburg. She took my job at the Columbia Project on International Procedure, became a whiz at it, no surprise. And in the months before I went off to Minnesota, we socialized a bit. I remember an evening at the Ginsburg apartment. Baby Jane had grown up a bit. There was Jimmy. There were 2 children. The most delicious dinner was served. They lived well. Marty was doing brilliantly at Weil Gotshal and Manges, and there may have been some family welfare. I never inquired about that. They had a grand apartment. The thing I learned that evening was Marty did the cooking. Ruth never cooked. Ruth was not domestic. That's not a criticism. It's just an observation that Marty was a jack of all trades, or a Marty of all trades. He did the cooking. He kept obligations together. He was developing, as I suggested before, the most amazing collection of clients on tax matters. And the intellectual work was left to Ruth. So she stayed with the project for a bit. I went off to Minnesota, learned that there is life in the tundra, in the snow, in the ice. We would correspond periodically. And then I think it was around 73, she went into academe at Rutgers and started to build that incredible reputation with regard to women's rights. She had no equal. She was arguing the biggest cases. This is shy Ruth. This is Ruth who would hide in the corner of the apartment in our student days, was blossoming. She was blossoming as a teacher, but more significantly, she was blossoming as an advocate. And it was a marriage made in heaven, namely Ruth Ginsburg and gender equality. Gender equality. So when Jimmy Carter became president of the United States, Marty put his associations to good use. She deserved to be a judge. She had all the qualifications of being a judge. But I doubt, this is my judgment, I doubt that she ever would have become a judge were it not for Marty. She had climbed the academic ladder as one did in those days. Less common today, less common today. But there is an academic ladder. Look, I did that. I went from Minnesota to Michigan to Harvard, and then decided I wanted to be back in New York. So I'm at NYU in my dotage. Ruth went from Rutgers to Columbia. So she was visible. Her advocacy made her visible. Being on a first-class, top-of-the-line faculty, Columbia made her visible. So in 1980, She became a member of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Now, people disagree. Some people say it's the second highest court in the land. Technically, there are 13 federal courts of appeal at that level, but there's no doubt the District of Columbia, along with the Second Circuit, which covers New York, and the Ninth Circuit, which covers California. But people have, well, they don't get into fist fights about this, but they disagree as to which of the United States courts of appeal are the most significant. But clearly, the District of Columbia Court of Appeals is either first or second, 2025. Maybe it's third. Let's not quibble. She became a federal judge with enormous visibility. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. Now, Ruth, as a Court of Appeals judge, continued gender equality as her intellectual and emotional centerpiece. She couldn't argue cases anymore, but she could be on a prestigious court that had some influence in that category. She got to know Scalia. You know Scalia. Scalia, one of the brilliant judges and then justice of the 20th century. They became great friends, even though they were polar opposites in terms of their judicial philosophy. Ruth was a liberal, but as a judge, when she joined the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, she was moderate. I emphasize that. Ruth was not a lefty as a judge on that court. She was not a rabid, let's break the world wide open judicially. She was a moderate. Now, some of you watching this, maybe many of you watching this, know her best because of her participation in so many gender equality cases and a variety of other civil rights cases. But in this period, from 80 until she went to the Supreme Court in 93, she would have been described with words like cautious, moderate, judicious, talented, of course. But in the world of politics, maybe you would say center left, but barely left, partially left, except in certain fields. Remember, Ruth's academic work was largely, and here again is a parallelism, exactly the same as mine. We were, and I continue to be, a proceduralist, a nitpicker, a guy involved, and she was involved in rules and commas and periods and syntax and what does the rule say? Talented, extremely talented. But that was the center of her academic work at Rutgers, then at Columbia, and therefore, not surprisingly, it affected and produced that caution, that judiciousness, that care about system and precedent, and all the things one sort of associates with conservatism, although the decisions are centrist, slightly left. There are some of my academic colleagues over the years who have found her too cautious, too judicious, too careful, not adventuresome enough. But that was Ruth as an academic and Ruth as a Court of Appeals judge. And then came 1993. And a vacancy on the Supreme Court opened up, and Clinton was president. Marty went to work again. He pulled in all of those tickets, all of the clients, all of the people he knew. He was a dynamo. A dynamo, a dynamo, a dynamo. It turned out there were two primary and secondary candidates for that Supreme Court vacancy. One was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all of the civil liberties people, all of the gender equality people lined up in back of Ruth. Powerful, powerful, powerful. The other candidate for the vacancy was Steve Breyer. Steve had been a member of the Harvard Law School faculty for many, many years. I was on that faculty for 35 years, and I think in 20 of my 35, Steve was my colleague on the Harvard Law School faculty. But Breyer had, like Ruth, achieved a judgeship. Breyer had become the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, the New England Circuit, so-called. So there's Ruth, a distinguished member of the Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia, and Steve, the chief judge of the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. I got to tell you, honest. I didn't know who I was for. Steve had been a close friend for those 20 years we shared on the Harvard Law School faculty. Man of enormous gifts. And Ruth had been my buddy and friend at that point for close to 40 years. There was only one woman on the court in those days, Sandra Day O'Connor. There had never been a Jewish woman on the court. It seemed as if either one could get the gold ring. I love them both, still think in those terms. There came a morning when I was giving a presentation to the annual conference of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia down in Washington. It was a big deal, those conferences in those days. Everybody is on display. Everybody wants to get to the conference. It was an honor to be on the program. And it was the morning of my presentation. I was early, got down there for breakfast, and there was Marty and Ruth, of course. They are members of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals Judicial Conference. Of course they were there. And they both came up to me and they hugged me. And then one of them, I don't remember who, probably Marty, said to me that, sorry, we're going to miss your program. We really were looking forward to it, but we have to miss it. We have to be in Washington, they said. We've been called to Washington. And then the two of them grinned at me. They grinned at me, and I knew Clinton had chosen Ruth. And within 24 hours, that was announced. And I no longer had to agonize because one of the two had made it. Ironically, Clinton's next appointment was Steve Breyer. And the two of them served together on the court. Now, on the court, Ruth became more and more active verbally. I remember arguing a couple of cases up there, and she scared me to death. She took no mercy on our friendship. She would push me and push me and push me. She became more and more of the person most of you think of when you think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The shyness was gone. She became more and more affirmative and active and involved, and remained that way from 93, which I believe is when she ascended, until the end of her distinguished tenure. We saw each other less and less because they led a very busy life, as Supreme Court justices do. But we would tease each other with little notes every once in a while. I knew that the Scalia-Ginsburg relationship was as firm as the media proclaimed it. Yes, they did go to the opera all the damn time. In a real sense, they loved each other, despite the fact that you couldn't get two people. They were polar opposites, but they cared. When ill health set in with Ruth, which started in about 99, whenever I would see Scalia, who was a wonderful person one-on-one, I'd ask after Ruth, and he would give me a firsthand account of her health or her difficulties. Some of you will recall that in about 2016, people started saying, hey, Ginsburg, get off the court. Get off the court. Let's get a new justice in there who can be left-leaning for 20, 30 years. But Ruth, you're aging. Get out of there. She didn't move. She believed that in 16, Hillary Clinton would win. And she could rely on Hillary Clinton to get a justice to replace her who was like her. She never believed that Obama would do that. But you will recall it was Trump's first term. So now, in a curious way, she's trapped. She knew that she could not rely on a Democratic president to find someone who looked like her, acted like her, and thought like her until at least 2021. But as you all know, she died in 2020. Throughout, by the way, she felt she could still do the job. And maybe by this point, and this is a maybe this she had a sense of self. She had become an icon. Remember that? She started to become an icon in about 2010, 2012. Notorious RBG. Books about her, toys, all sorts of stuff emerged. And she really loved it. And I think it affected her judgment. I think it affected her judgment as to whether to create a spot for Obama or for Hillary if Hillary won. She liked it. Her daughter, Baby Jane, remember Baby Jane? Baby Jane went to the Harvard Law School and became my student. And today is on the Columbia faculty as a great specialist in international copyright. So you can take your theory that she was ego-driven in failing to step off the court, or that she had a master plan that assumed that Hillary would beat Trump. I spent an afternoon with Ruth a couple of months before she passed. She had survived from 99 to the spring of 2020. And she and I had agreed to do a little interactive babble about something or other. I don't even remember what it was. So the two of us sat in front of a camera for an hour and a half. And she was alive. She was not the shy Ruth hiding in the corner. She was Ruth. And after we had done the recording, she invited me back into chambers, which are very special, they're very large and glorious at the Supreme Court. And she showed me all the trinkets about notorious RBG, all the crazy things that emerged as she emerged as a pop figure. She seemed alive and well. I think she was waiting for 2021. I think she was waiting in the hope that the Trump term would end and that somebody like Biden would come in. And her slot would be filled. She assumed another woman. Sandra Day O'Connor had left the court. Ruth was the only woman on the court. Then slowly, Kagan and Sotomayor joined the court. And Ruth thought, 2021, we can get a Democratic president to create a vacancy and fill it with a Ruth Bader Ginsburg II. But sadly, she never made it to 2021. And that opportunity was lost. That's the theory I believe in, not the theory that notorious RBG had gone to her head. But by 2020, by that last period, she had become the Ruth Ginsburg, the dynamic Ruth Ginsburg, the active Ruth Ginsburg, the strong Ruth Ginsburg. Her dissents were powerful, pointed, beautifully written. And that, my friends, is my 70 years with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I missed her. But I guess I should stop, Mr. President.
Thank you, Professor Miller. We all miss her with you. So on behalf of the National Judicial College, we truly appreciate you taking the time to be with us, share with us such a rich and touching stories about your friend. And as a token of our appreciation, we wanted to present you our traditional gift, which is a crystal gavel. I don't know if you have one of these with you, but we will be sending it off to you.
Oh.
And also, as I promised yesterday, I'm going to send you one of our signature T-shirt that emblazoned in it is "Everyone deserves a good judge."
Ah.
And you told me yesterday that Aaron Judge is your neighbor, and so we were going to send you an extra one if you could give it to him as well. Everyone deserves a good judge. So
I will try. That's very generous of you. Very generous. Very sweet of you.
Thank you.
I will cherish both items.
Thank you so much.
I haven't bored everybody.
No, it's been great, Professor Miller, and thank you. You're always so kind, and I do appreciate it. And I think we may have one question, Elizabeth, and if you don't mind, we just want to have one question.
Elizabeth? I have two.
Okay, great.
So let's start with my first one, which is lawyers and judges seem to be facing unique pressures today. What would your friend Ruth do?
By the last 10 years of her life, she would meet it head on. She would not shirk her duties in any way. She might even become vocal about the independence of the federal courts. That's one thing she learned from Sandra Day O'Connor. They became great friends when they were together on the court. Sandra Day believed in the independence of the federal courts and of all courts. And that's what Ruth believed. And I suspect she would have become quite vocal about it. And, you know, there are those who fear that at the moment, the country must have faith that the federal courts will cherish their independence and their duties under the Constitution. And I have no doubt that Ruth would be front and center.
Thank you. I have one more for you, and but thank you so much for your time today. This one is more of a hypothetical. If you, Marty, and Ruth were having dinner today, what do you think the dinner conversation would be about? And the second part to this is, and if there was a debate, who would win?
Well, Marty would be the loudest. And I would be completely deferential to the justice. That's my nature. People like Harvard Law School professors and judges scare me to death. So it's perfectly clear Ruth would win. Whatever the issue, Ruth would win. What would be the topic of conversation? I strongly believe that it would be the very thing that's implicit in the first question, the role of the federal courts and of all judges in every state court to act as a bulwark and protector of the Constitution of the United States, and the need that all judges retain their independence and their devotion to their obligations. I think that was always central to her. But Marty would tell jokes.
Thank you, Professor Miller, and thank you for that strong message. I want to thank the audience also for joining us, and we'll see you again next year. Thank you all.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor.
Did anyone stay awake while I babbled?
I am being just filled with wonderful, wonderful comments about how this was wonderful. They really enjoyed hearing all about this. They've learned things they didn't know. Just wonderful.
Well,
Thank you, Professor Miller. I think you have some of your former students were also in the audience and texting me, so it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
And several people have now just shouted in the chat, yes, they're absolutely awake and listening.
that's good. That's good. That's good. Well, I hope to see you folks three-dimensionally at some point.
Would love that. Thank you so much. And good luck with your Yankees this season.
Well, maybe they should. They won yesterday. Maybe they should quit. Maybe they should quit. You, best of luck to you and the institution.
Thank you.
And the great work you folks do.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that. Thank you.